He walks alone, not because he enjoys the silence, but because he finally understood its purpose. There was a time he begged to be understood, a time when he feared the weight of solitude, mistaking it for failure, a time when the absence of voices felt like a punishment. But silence was never the enemy. It was the mirror, the kind that doesn't flatter, the kind that doesn't lie, the kind that reflects the truth you've been running from. He stopped running. No more chasing echoes of approval. No more standing at the gates of others, waiting to be let in. No more negotiating his worth with people who didn't know how to value themselves. The noise never gave him peace. The crowds never gave him clarity. And the applause, it always faded faster than the effort it demanded. So he turned inward, and that's where everything changed. This isn't a story of someone who had support. It's the story of someone who had to become his own support. Someone who had to stand up without a helping hand. Someone who had to find his way when no one pointed a direction. Pain was his mentor. Stillness was his classroom. And the absence of rescue became the birthplace of strength. He learned that no one is coming, that rescue is a fairy tale for those who still believe life owes them something, that discipline is not built on comfort. It is carved alone in the cold mornings and silent nights. And yet, there is a beauty in walking alone, a sacredness in rising without witnesses, a power in doing the work, unseen and uncelebrated. The Stoics understood this. They didn't seek to be remembered. They sought to be aligned, not with opinions, but with principle, not with reward, but with virtue. They knew that strength was not loud, that peace was not soft, that real freedom comes when you no longer need permission to live on your terms. So this is not a guide for the comfortable. This is a call to those who are tired of waiting, tired of hoping someone will come and fix it, tired of giving power to everything except themselves. If you're here, it's because you've felt it too. The emptiness of dependence, the disorientation of waiting, the silent scream that echoes when you realize no one's coming. Good, because that's the beginning of you becoming your own answer, the beginning of quiet power, of internal order, of walking alone, not in despair, but in sovereignty. You don't need more praise. You don't need another promise. You don't need someone to come hold your hand. You need to walk step by step, without the noise, without the crowd, without help, because once you rise on your own, you'll never kneel again. This is not motivation. It's remembrance of who you were before the noise, of what you are when the masks fall off, of how far you can go when you stop waiting and finally begin. Lesson 1 begins where most refuse to go, into the silence. Not the peaceful kind, not the romanticized escape, but the uncomfortable stillness where all distractions die, where the phone is off, the room is still, and your thoughts no longer have anywhere to hide. This is where the journey truly starts. Not in ambition, not in motivation, but in silence. Raw, unfiltered and brutal. Because silence doesn't lie, it doesn't soothe, it confronts. It tells you what you've been avoiding. It holds up a mirror to your chaos. And it asks one question without speaking. Can you sit with yourself without running? Most can't. They fill the void with noise, music, scrolling, endless chatter. They fear what might surface if things ever get quiet. But the Stoics knew, if you can't be alone with your own mind, you're not free. You're just busy. When you strip everything away, the likes, the replies, the eyes watching, what's left? What's left when no one's texting you back? When no one sees your progress? When no one claps for your effort? That's the test. That's the beginning of real strength. Because when you master the silence, you master yourself. There's power in not needing noise. There's clarity in not needing input. And there's peace in knowing your mind is no longer your enemy. The first lesson is simple to understand and hard to live. Withdraw, not forever, not from life, but just long enough to hear your own truth. Uninterrupted, undiluted, unapologetic. Start small, 1 hour, then 2. Then a day where you answer to no one but your own conscience. Let the discomfort rise, let it press against you, because behind that discomfort is clarity. And clarity is what cowards avoid. It's what the world tries to drown. But you're not here to escape. You're here to rebuild, not louder but deeper. And rebuilding requires demolition of distractions, of illusions, of the false self that was kept alive by noise. So you sit with the pain, you sit with the cravings, you sit with the loneliness that once made you beg for attention, and then you stop needing it, because in that moment, you meet someone, not new, not foreign. You meet the version of you that's been waiting to be heard without interruption. You meet the version of yourself that doesn't chase, that doesn't perform, that doesn't beg for a place at tables that were never built for him. He just sits and knows that the external world is fragile, knows that applause fades, knows that validation is a currency that loses value the moment you depend on it. This version of you is rare. He's been buried under years of conditioning, smothered by the pressure to be liked, to be needed, to be seen. But now, in the absence of all that noise, he can finally breathe. He doesn't smile for approval. He doesn't shrink for comfort. He doesn't fake joy to make others less uncomfortable. He's honest, raw, grounded, not because he's perfect, but because he no longer has the energy to perform. And this is where your transformation begins. Not when you feel good, not when life aligns with your plans, but when you're stripped bare and you realize you are still whole. Lesson 1 is brutal for a reason. It doesn't flatter your ego. It starves it. It breaks the addiction to external noise, because that noise is what's kept you from knowing who you really are. This silence, it is your teacher. Not the kind with soft hands and sweet lessons, but the kind that burns away everything false. The Stoics practiced this. They didn't speak unless it mattered. They didn't act unless it aligned. They lived under the weight of discipline, not for glory, but for freedom. Marcus Aurelius wrote alone in the corners of his chambers, not for the world to read, but to remind himself of who he was trying to become. That is the path. You don't do it for the crowd. You do it to stay clean when no one's watching, to stay honest when lies are profitable, to stay still when reaction is expected. So ask yourself, can you sit in a room with no task, no entertainment, no audience, and remain at peace? If not, you are still chained. Not by people, but by your dependence on them. The silent man is feared because he needs nothing, and a man who needs nothing cannot be controlled, not by trends, not by manipulation, not by fear. When you master this internal posture, you'll begin to notice the shift. Conversations change. You speak less, but your words carry weight. People notice when you move, because you don't move often. When you withdraw, they wonder what you're building, but you're not building for them. You're building for yourself, for your peace, for your mind, for your future, and suddenly you stop caring who's watching, because now you are. You're watching your patterns, you're watching your impulses, you're watching your discipline in the dark, where no one will give you credit. And there, in that quiet tracking of self, a new form of pride is born. Not ego, but respect. For the man you are becoming, for the mind you're repairing, for the integrity you're protecting. People will never understand the man who moves like this, who walks alone, not because he has to, but because he chooses to, not out of bitterness, but because solitude has become sacred. And that's what you must remember. Walking alone doesn't mean being lost. It means knowing your way so well. You don't need anyone to lead you. Silence is not emptiness. It is precision. It is power. It doesn't make you invisible, it makes you unshakable. And when you learn to walk in silence, you'll hear the only voice that matters, your own. That's when the real journey begins. Not louder, not brighter, but deeper. And from that depth, you will rise. You rise, not because someone reached for your hand, but because you stopped expecting hands. The silence became too familiar and the floor too cold. You understood what most never do. No one is coming, not to rescue you, not to explain what went wrong, not to finish the things you abandoned. You waited for understanding, for forgiveness, for the world to recognize your pain, and none of it came. That's when the weight shifted, from disappointment to discipline, because waiting is a slow form of self-betrayal. It feels passive, but it rots you from within. Every moment spent hoping is a moment not building. Every hope for rescue is a delay in your own decision. You thought you needed help, but what you needed was resolve. The world isn't unfair, it's indifferent. It does not ask if you're tired, it does not ask if you're ready, it just moves. And those who stand still get left behind. This is the part where most retreat. They beg for reassurance. They ask for signs. They collapse quietly, hoping someone will notice. But you didn't collapse. You adjusted your posture and you stood, not because you were healed, not because you were sure, but because the alternative was staying broken. That's the truth people don't want to hear. Healing does not begin with answers. It begins with movement, even while bleeding, even while uncertain, especially while uncertain. The Stoics knew this. Life was never meant to be fair. It was meant to be faced. No guarantees, no comfort, just choices. Each one a step, each step a vote for the kind of man you are becoming. There are no mentors in the darkest nights. There are no maps when your world collapses. There is only you and the next move. And in that silence, you either fold or you forge. You forged. You didn't scream. You didn't beg. You didn't announce it. You just got up because something inside you whispered, not this time, not again. You remembered that dignity is not loud. It doesn't ask for permission. It simply acts. When you stopped waiting, you started winning. Not in public, not in applause, but in the quiet discipline that said, I'm not going to die here, not like this, and you didn't. You rose, not because you were ready, but because you were done being available to your own excuses. And that moment was your return, not to comfort but to clarity. You began to see that standing alone is not a punishment. It's a privilege, because the man who needs no one can become anything, and the man who rises alone will never kneel again. Lesson 2 is brutal for the ego, but necessary for the soul. Stop. Expecting, stop. Hoping. Stop assuming that someone will see your effort and step in. The moment you accept this, everything changes. You stop outsourcing your strength. You stop negotiating your dignity. You stop delaying your rise. You begin to take full ownership of the one thing that was always yours. Your response. You cannot control their absence. You cannot control who stayed or who left. You cannot control the doors that closed or the words that were never said, but you can control what you do next. And most people never do. They pause their life, waiting for apologies, waiting for justice, waiting for clarity that never comes. The Stoics would call this slavery, waiting on what is outside of you to move so you can feel free inside. That is not freedom, that is dependence dressed as hope, and it's a trap. You tell yourself you just need closure, that you just want to understand, that you just need them to see your side. But what you really want is someone to relieve you of the burden of moving forward. Alone, that relief will not come. And that's not cruelty, that's reality. And facing reality is the first act of liberation. No one is coming, not because they're bad, not because they don't care, but because they are busy carrying their own weight. And now, so must you. This doesn't mean you can't ask for help. It means you no longer wait for it to begin. Your life cannot be postponed. Your healing cannot be borrowed. It has to come from you, or it doesn't come at all. The man who understands this becomes dangerous not in violence, but in self-command. He acts before he feels ready. He speaks when silence would be more comfortable. He cuts ties not out of hatred, but because peace costs too much to negotiate. He no longer says maybe one day, or if they just understood, or I'll wait until things calm down. He says now. He doesn't always win, but he never loses time, and that is what separates him from everyone else. He moves, even when his heart is heavy, even when the ground shakes, even when he's afraid, because he learned that progress has nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with decision. You've spent too many nights rehearsing pain, reliving moments, rewriting endings in your mind, as if mental edits could change real outcomes. They can't. But they do one thing very well. They keep you stuck in what you wish had been, stuck in what they never said, stuck in a chapter that was never going to end the way you hoped. It's time to close it anyway. The ending you wanted is not required for the beginning you need. This is where most people stay behind, looking backward, hoping that something makes sense before they move on. You are not most people, you walk. Not because it's all clear, but because your peace matters more than the explanation. You act, not because the story is complete, but because your time is not negotiable. Let the silence be your signal. Let the absence be your permission. When you stop waiting, you start living. And when you start living, the world has no choice but to respond. You stopped asking to be chosen, you chose yourself. You stopped chasing the old version of you, you buried him. You stopped hoping they would come back. You built a life they no longer fit into, and that is the power of rising without help. It creates a version of you that doesn't depend, that doesn't explain, that doesn't pause his life hoping someone else presses play. You are no longer hoping, you are executing, and execution is the purest form of self-respect. You begin to realize how much time you wasted, waiting to feel ready, waiting for motivation, waiting for some kind of green light from life. But life doesn't give you signs, it gives you moments, and you either move or you don't. Every day, you delay action. You reinforce a version of yourself that doesn't trust his own power, and the world responds accordingly. People sense when you hesitate, when you shrink, when you hand them the pen and ask them to write your story. They may not say it, but they feel it. You become easier to overlook, easier to forget, easier to disrespect. Not because you are weak, but because you refuse to act like you are strong. That changes now. You no longer need a cheerleader. You need a mission, a quiet one, a deep one, the kind that doesn't make noise, but shifts your entire posture. The Stoics didn't wake up every day looking for reasons to act. They acted because it was time, because the duty was real, because the moment existed. And that was enough. You don't need clarity to take the first step. The first step creates the clarity. You don't need energy to build discipline. Discipline is the source of the energy you lack. You don't need someone to walk with you. You just need to stop walking away from yourself. Let this part of your life be remembered for one thing: movement, not perfection, not applause, not balance, just movement, because even a single step away from passivity, away from dependency, away from waiting, can change everything. You think you need a miracle. You don't. You need momentum, and that's something no one can give. But you can generate it. In silence, in discomfort, in resistance. That's what makes it real, because nothing built in comfort ever lasts. Nothing gained through external force ever sustains. You want results that stay. Then build them in the shadows. Build them when no one texts back. Build them when no one checks in. Build them when no one claps. Build them when it's raining, when it's late, when it hurts. That's the difference between motivation and commitment. Motivation visits you. Commitment is who you become. And once you become that man, the one who acts without applause, who keeps his promises even when no one's watching, who follows through without confirmation, then you become rare. Not flashy, not loud, but deeply undeniable. The kind of man who doesn't need to speak his value, because his life speaks it for him. His schedule speaks it, his posture speaks it, his peace speaks it. And when others see him, they sense it, without knowing why, without needing explanation. That is the energy of self-respect. And it is earned, one silent step at a time. Most will never get there, because they want comfort and confidence before they begin. You're not most, you're done waiting. You're done explaining. You're done hoping for something external to push you, because now you've become the push, you've become the force, the reason, the clarity, the plan. You are your own rescue, your own answer, your own permission. And that kind of man can walk into any storm and not lose himself, because he didn't build himself in calm. Whether he forged himself in silence, without help, without comfort, without being asked, he didn't wait for the weight to be lifted. He lifted it, and now he carries something stronger than muscle. He carries certainty, the certainty of knowing that no matter what happens, he will act, he will move, he will rise alone if necessary, without help if needed, but always forward. You keep moving, not because it's easy, but because the alternative is unacceptable. Standing still is no longer an option. You've already seen what waiting costs. You've already tasted the bitterness of hesitation. Now you walk, even when the road is unclear, even when your legs are heavy, even when your mind tries to argue with your mission, because something inside you knows, if you pause too long, you disappear. Not to the world, but to yourself. That's what people don't understand about discipline. It's not about control. It's about identity. Every time you show up, you remind yourself who you are, and every time you don't, you forget it. Doesn't take much to lose yourself. Just one excuse repeated enough times, just one delay that becomes a habit, just one lie told to avoid discomfort. That's all it takes to slip, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, consistently, until one day you look in the mirror and don't recognize the man looking back. He's softer, weaker, still waiting for something to change, but not you, not anymore, because you know now that pain is not the enemy. Comfort is. It lulls you, tricks you, convinces you that this moment can wait, that your potential is something optional, something that can be postponed. But every second you delay, someone else is getting sharper. Someone else is using their silence to grow, and the gap between you and who you could be widens. You're done widening that gap. You're ready to close it, not through speed, but through consistency, not through bursts, but through silent, steady action, one step, then another, without anyone watching, without anyone clapping, because the applause is not the reward. The man you become is. That's what the Stoics mastered. They didn't ask if the task was fair, they asked if it was theirs to do. And if it was, they did it. Without question, without noise, without needing someone to remind them why it mattered. They were their own compass, their own source, their own fire. That's the lesson. Become the man who doesn't need to be convinced, who doesn't need to feel ready, who doesn't need the weather to be perfect. Become the man who acts, because that's who he is. Discipline is not a system, it's not a schedule, it's not a tool. It's identity, it's who you decide to be when no one is watching, when no one is waiting, when no one will know. That decision made in silence is the beginning of power, not power over others, power over yourself, power over your fear, your weakness, your doubts, your impulses, because when you own yourself, you become unbreakable. And that is what this path is creating. Not a man who never feels pain, but a man who doesn't surrender to it. Not a man who never falls, but a man who never stays down. Not a man who needs help to rise, but a man who has become help to himself. That's the version of you that's emerging quietly, patiently, relentlessly, step by step, in the dark, without guidance, without reward, until one day you look in the mirror again and this time you recognize him, not because he's finished, but because he's real, uncompromising, unapologetic, unshakable. And when that man walks into the world moves, not because he demands it, but because presence, built in silence, always speaks louder than noise. You no longer ask for direction, you walk it. You no longer chase validation. You embody truth. You no longer explain your choices. You become the result. And no one can take that from you because no one gave it to you. You built it alone. In the hours no one saw, in the moments no one cared, and now you carry something no one can steal. Certainty. Lesson 3 begins with a fall. Not the kind people see, but the kind that happens in silence, a private collapse, a quiet failure, a moment when everything you built slips between your fingers. You tried, you believed, you gave everything you had, and it still wasn't enough. That's where most people break, not because the pain is too strong, but because they expected the path to be fair. They believed that effort guaranteed reward, that discipline prevented collapse, that good intentions were a shield. But life doesn't work that way. And the Stoics knew it. You are not owed results. You are not promised understanding. You are not protected from the consequences of reality. And when the fall comes, it will strip you of everything false, the titles, the excuses, the illusion of control. It will leave you with one thing: truth. The truth about your limits, the truth about your strength, the truth about how much of your identity was built on comfort. That truth hurts, but it's sacred because it's clean. No more pretending, no more performance, just you, your failure. And the decision that follows: you can collapse further, or you can rise, but you don't rise the same way you did before. You rise slower, wiser, more deliberate, because the pain taught you something that advice never could. You now understand that real growth doesn't feel like winning. It feels like breaking first. It feels like humiliation, like regret, like starting from the ground while others pass you by. But hidden in that pain is a blueprint, a new way forward, one that isn't based on fantasy, but forged in reality. The Stoics embraced failure. They didn't fear it, because they knew what it revealed. It revealed the parts of you that were soft, the parts that craved ease, the parts that folded under pressure. And once exposed, those parts could be rebuilt, not with affirmation, but with fire. Because discipline is born in the ashes of who you used to be. You thought strength was built through success. It's not. It's built through recovery, through self-respect, through action, taken in the ruins. When you lose, that's when you meet yourself, and that version of you, the one who keeps going despite the loss, is the one who can never be broken again, because he no longer fears the fall. He's already lived it. He no longer avoids pain. He's already endured it. He no longer waits for someone to fix him. He's already started rebuilding alone, without help, without applause, without needing to be seen. And that kind of rebuilding, that kind of resilience is rare. It creates a depth in you that no book can teach, no mentor can transfer, no speech can inspire, because it's not an idea. It's a scar, and scars do not lie. They are earned through silence, through nights no one saw, through days you kept moving when everything said stop. That's the difference between the one who talks about strength and the one who walks with it. He has fallen, he has failed, and he has risen again. Not as a version of who he was, but as someone new, someone solid, someone stable, someone who no longer fears failure because failure became his foundation. You begin to walk differently, not because you learned how to avoid the fall, but because you've survived it. There's a silence in your movement now, a calm edge, a presence that doesn't beg to be noticed. Because when you've lost and kept going, you stop needing to prove anything. You've already faced the worst version of yourself and lived to correct him, and that's what changes everything. The fall made you honest. It stripped away your delusions, your expectations, your attachment to how things should be. You see things clearly now. You're no longer looking for fairness. You're looking for alignment. You're no longer asking, why did this happen to me? You're asking, what do I do with what happened? And that shift, that simple change in focus, is the birth of power. Because when you ask better questions, you live a better life. You stop waiting for the pain to end and start using it. You stop chasing comfort and start building capacity. You stop performing for validation and start acting from conviction. The Stoics taught this not as theory, but as lived reality. They lost friends, they lost battles, they lost health, and still remained grounded. Not because they felt nothing, but because they had already made peace with how little control they truly had. And in that surrender, they discovered something most people never find: freedom. The kind of freedom that doesn't require success, just clarity, just integrity, just relentless movement in the direction of what matters. They didn't need the world to make sense because they had made sense of themselves. That's your work. Now, not fixing everything, but facing everything with open eyes and firm steps. You no longer say, I need things to go my way. You say, I'll keep moving either way. That's where strength begins. Not in dominance, not in certainty, but in consistency, doing what must be done. Even when you feel broken, especially when you feel broken, because that is where your character is built. Not when things go right, but when everything goes wrong and you refuse to retreat. You stand. Even when shaky, you act. Even while afraid, you show up. Even when no one is watching. And in that, you become untouchable. Not because you're immune to pain, but because pain no longer stops you. You respect it. You learn from it, but you do not bow to it. You've walked through your own failure and come out on the other side, not faster, not louder, but real. And real men are rare. The kind of men who don't explain themselves. They live with such clarity that explanation is unnecessary. The kind of men who don't chase shortcuts because they know every step matters, even the painful ones, especially the painful ones you no longer see. Mistakes as something to erase. You see them as bricks, heavy, sharp, essential. You build with them, you learn from them, you honor them, because you know, without those exact moments, you wouldn't be this version of yourself, the one who keeps going. Not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. The one who no longer waits for things to feel right, because he knows the right time is when he says so. The one who walks into his next failure, not with fear, but with fire, because this time you understand that every fall is part of the form, and every scar is proof you're still rising. You carry your past differently now, not like a burden, but like a tool. You no longer try to hide it. You no longer explain it. You simply carry it with calm strength because it made you, and you've stopped apologizing for that. Lesson 3 doesn't end with the fall. It ends with how you treat yourself after. That's where most people fail, not in the failure itself, but in the shame that follows. They internalize the collapse. They build identities from regret. They label themselves by moments they were never meant to stay in, but not you. You see the fall for what it was: necessary, inconvenient, liberating. It exposed what was weak, what was fake, what needed to end. And now you stand differently, not in spite of it, but because of it. You don't carry shame, you carry structure. You no longer ask, why did I fail? You ask, what did I ignore? You no longer say that shouldn't have happened. You say that's exactly what I needed to see. This mindset changes everything, because now nothing is wasted. Not the pain, not the silence, not the nights when no one saw you bleeding internally. All of it serves you. Even the parts you wish had gone differently, they still shaped you, still sharpened you, still showed you who you are when everything falls away. And now you no longer fear falling, you fear wasting time, you fear dishonesty, you fear becoming soft again. Because softness is not gentleness. Softness is surrendering your edge, your direction, your fire. And you fought too hard to get it back. The Stoics didn't glamorize pain, they refined it. They used it to polish their character, to remind themselves that no moment was ever guaranteed. And because of that, they lived fully, not emotionally, but deliberately. Every step, every breath was rooted in awareness. That is where you are now, not just walking forward, but walking forward awake. And that awareness changes how you choose, what you tolerate, how you respond. You stop negotiating with mediocrity. You stop chasing comfort. You stop explaining your discipline to those who don't understand it. Because now you've earned your solitude, not as a sentence, but as a sanctuary. A place where your thoughts are clear, your actions are yours. Your direction is no longer decided by other people's confusion. That's what the fall gave you. Clarity. Clarity that doesn't shake when criticized, clarity that doesn't beg to be agreed with. It simply is. And that is more powerful than any motivation, because motivation fades, clarity fuels. It reminds you why you can't go back, why that older version of you, the one who hesitated, who apologized for wanting more, who waited for permission, had to go. He couldn't carry what you carry now. He would have dropped it. He would have broken under it. But you don't, because you've already been broken. And the pieces you put back were chosen with intention. Not all of them returned. Some were buried. Some were discarded. And what remained was real. You no longer seek to be understood. You seek to be aligned. You no longer crave acceptance. You crave peace. You no longer fear losing people because you've found something they can't give you and can never take away: respect for the man you've become. Not because he's perfect, but because he's honest. He fell, he failed, he stood again alone. And that's all that matters now. Lesson 4 begins with a simple truth. Most people never move because they are waiting for company. They say they're stuck, but they're really just afraid to walk alone. They wait for someone to support them, to motivate them, to tell them it's the right time, but the right time never arrives, and the support rarely comes, so they stay wishing, waiting, watching others live. This is how most lives quietly die, not in tragedy, but in hesitation. You weren't meant to be one of them. You weren't meant to freeze every time the path looks empty. You weren't meant to shrink just because no one is clapping. You were built to move, even if no one understands where you're going, even if the first steps feel shaky, even if the silence around you is deafening. Because that silence, that space between you and everyone else, is not abandonment, it's invitation. An invitation to discover how far you can go without needing someone to drag you. That's what separates strength from dependency. Dependency says, I can't unless they come. Strength says, I'll go whether or not they do. You don't need a crowd, you need a reason. And if your reason isn't strong enough to move you, no person ever will be. People think the danger is being alone, but the real danger is never knowing who you are without others. When you need someone to watch, you adjust yourself to be seen. When you need someone to follow, you betray your own direction. When you need someone to agree, you abandon your conviction, and slowly you become unrecognizable. You smile when you're not happy. You nod when you're unsure. You move only when it feels safe. That's not growth, that's performance, and performance is fragile. It cracks under pressure, it collapses without applause. But movement that comes from within, that's different. It doesn't shatter when ignored, it doesn't need permission, it doesn't stop when questioned. It continues, because it's rooted in purpose, not in popularity. The Stoics lived this. They didn't need followers, they needed virtue. They didn't wait for company, they walked with clarity. They knew that walking alone is not a weakness. It is a filter. It removes what is unnecessary. It reveals what is essential, and it sharpens what is real. When you walk alone, you hear your own thoughts, you feel your own weight, you meet your own resistance, and then you overcome it, not through encouragement but through endurance. You become a man who doesn't pause for applause, who doesn't wait to be understood, who doesn't delay his purpose waiting for alignment with others. You move because you are ready, and if you're not ready, you move anyway. Because readiness is not a feeling, it is a habit, a choice made over and over again, until fear no longer has the power to freeze you. You've already delayed too long, postponed your rise, dimmed your light for comfort, but now you see it clearly. No one is coming to walk this road for you. No one is responsible for your next step. You are. And that's not punishment, that's privilege, because once you take that step alone, you will never again be owned by silence. You will never again mistake the absence of support for the absence of strength. You will remember that what moves you isn't behind you, isn't beside you. It's within you. Move alone, and something inside you unlocks. The hesitation fades, not because fear disappears, but because you stop needing certainty to act. You realize that waiting for someone to join you was just another way of stalling, because deep down, you already knew the truth. Most people won't come, not because they don't care, but because they can't see what you see. Your vision was given to you, not to the crowd, not to the comfort seekers, not to the ones who need to be convinced to you. And now you're done trying to convince anyone. You walk, even if they stare, even if they laugh, even if they whisper when you turn your back, because their noise cannot reach where you are going, and their absence does not stop your movement. You no longer beg for understanding. You create distance. You no longer explain why you're changing. You change. You no longer try to prove you're right. You simply stay consistent, and in that consistency, you become something very rare, a man who is unshakable in his solitude, not because he never wanted company, but because he no longer needs it to move. That's the shift. You stop needing and start choosing. You choose your pace, your silence, your focus. You choose what to pursue and what to walk away from. And when people don't understand, you let them go, because you no longer anchor your life to their ability to comprehend it. You're not angry, you're just done trying to fit into places that required you to shrink, done trying to make others comfortable while you stay stuck, done waiting for someone to say, "Now you're allowed to begin." You already began quietly without their approval, without their help. And that's why you'll keep going long after they lose momentum. They waited for energy, you created it. They waited for signs, you became one. They waited for company, you walked ahead. And now they see the space between you and wonder how you got so far. But they won't understand because they weren't there. When it was dark, when it was quiet, when it was lonely, they weren't there. When you doubted yourself, but acted anyway. When you collapsed, but stood again. When you wanted to quit, but kept your promises to yourself. Those are the moments that forged your spine, not the praise, not the noise, not the eyes watching, but the silence, where only your discipline remained. And now, that silence is no longer your enemy, it is your advantage. Because in a world full of people who can only move when seen, you move unseen. You build in the dark, you sharpen in private, you commit without attention, and in doing so, you become undeniable. You stop forcing things, you stop chasing people, you stop running from solitude, because solitude became your sharpening ground. That's why you no longer chase conversations that go nowhere, why you no longer explain changes that were necessary, why you no longer try to carry people who chose not to move. It's not pride, it's clarity. You don't hate them. You've simply chosen your life over their comfort, your peace over their confusion, your direction over their approval, and now you walk with something stronger than momentum. You walk with conviction. Conviction becomes your compass, not emotion, not opinion, not the shifting voices of the crowd. You don't ask, what do they think? You ask, does this align with who I've decided to be? That single question is how you reclaim your time, your focus, your direction. Because when you need nothing from others, you become precise, you say less, but everything you say has weight. You move less, but every step is intentional. You no longer run in circles, trying to be understood. You've traded validation for vision, and that vision requires solitude. Not because you're meant to be alone forever, but because you must be whole before you can walk beside anyone. When you need someone to complete you, you lose yourself. When you need someone to motivate you, you outsource your fire. When you need someone to fix, you delay your own rise. But when you become your own source, you change the energy of everything around you. You no longer attract chaos, you attract clarity. You no longer tolerate disrespect. You walk away with peace. You no longer explain your value. You embody it. The Stoics lived this silently. They didn't argue with fools. They didn't chase admiration. They didn't demand acknowledgement. They acted in alignment and let the results speak. Sometimes those results were seen, often they were not, but that didn't matter because their standard was internal. That's how you live now. Not for recognition, but for integrity. Not to be liked, but to stay clear. Not to impress, but to remain in truth. This makes you different. Not better, but different. And that difference will isolate you. You'll feel it when you walk away from things that no longer match your path. When you decline invitations that take you off course. When you say no to conversations that drain your clarity. At first, it feels like loss. Like distance, like emptiness. But then it begins to feel like peace, like focus, like power. Because now you don't need noise to feel alive. You don't need people to feel worthy. You don't need movement to feel progress. You know the difference between stillness and stagnation, between aloneness and abandonment, between peace and performance. You've become sharper, calmer, stronger. Not because life got easier, but because you stopped making it harder. You stopped waiting for signs, for support, for permission. You became the sign, you became the support. You gave yourself the permission. And in doing so, you discovered something most people never will. You don't need more. You need less noise, less input, less dependency. And in that space, you find your real self, quiet, solid, unshakable. You stop measuring progress by attention and start measuring it by alignment. You stop asking who's watching and start asking, am I proud of how I moved today? You stop seeking comfort and start building capacity to carry more, to feel deeper, to stand longer. You are no longer moved by compliments or destroyed by silence. You walk alone if needed, quiet if required, focused always. And when the world wonders why you're not chasing what everyone else chases, you smile because you're not chasing. You're building in the dark, in the silence, without help, but never without purpose. Lesson 5 reveals a truth few are willing to face. Most of your suffering doesn't come from the situation. It comes from your refusal to let go. You carry conversations that ended years ago. You rehearse mistakes you already learned from. You hold on to versions of yourself that no longer serve your path. And in doing so, you stay stuck. Not because the door is locked, but because you keep trying to open it backwards. There is no peace in trying to finish a story that life already ended. But the ego hates this. It wants closure, it wants control, it wants the past to make sense. So it keeps you turning pages in a book that no longer writes you back. Letting go isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It's knowing when to stop pouring your energy into something that's already burned out. It's understanding that not everything unresolved needs resolution. The Stoics accepted this. They didn't dwell, they didn't cling, they didn't define themselves by what was already gone. They lived in the present, not in theory, but in discipline. because they understood that peace isn't found by rearranging the past, it's found by anchoring in the now. You want peace, but you revisit pain. You want freedom, but you hold chains. That contradiction is the reason you feel heavy. You cannot carry everything and move forward at the same time. At some point you must decide what goes with you and what must stay behind. This is not abandonment, it's alignment. You are not betraying your past, you are honoring your future by refusing to drag what no longer fits into a chapter it was never meant to belong. Some people won't come with you. Some dreams won't survive the process. Some identities will have to be buried. But that's what growth demands. Shedding, not adding, removing, not collecting. You become lighter, not because life gets easier, but because you finally stop carrying what was never yours to hold forever. This takes courage, more than most expect, because letting go feels like loss. At first, like failure, like giving up, like defeat. But it's not. It's clarity in motion, and clarity will always feel like loss to the version of you that was addicted to confusion. You mourn it, not because it was right, but because it was familiar. And now you walk away, not to escape but to evolve, to reclaim the energy that was bleeding into people who didn't value it, into patterns that drained you, into hopes that no longer aligned. You close the door without slamming it, without bitterness, without noise, because true letting go is quiet. It doesn't seek revenge, it doesn't seek recognition, it just exits, fully, cleanly, with peace, and that is power. Letting go is not a single act, it is a discipline, a quiet refusal to carry what no longer feeds you, a repeated decision to choose peace over explanation. You will be tempted to look back, to revisit the conversations, to open wounds that were beginning to close, but you don't. Not because you're numb, but because you've grown. You no longer need the final word. You no longer chase understanding from those who never listened. You walk away, not with anger, but with authority. Because the man you're becoming cannot be built in the ruins of the man you used to be. You don't build a future by clinging to fragments. You build it by clearing space. That's the hard part, not the movement, the clearing, the space you must create between who you were and who you are now committed to becoming. That space will feel empty at first. You'll want to fill it with distractions, with noise, with people who only half belong. But you wait. You let the silence speak. You let the stillness sharpen you, because you've learned that anything rushed is rarely real. Letting go is not just about what you release. It's also about what you protect: your energy, your clarity, your standards. You no longer compromise to keep people close. You no longer bend to stay comfortable. You no longer soften your truth to be accepted. You are no longer afraid of being misunderstood because you understand yourself, and that is more valuable than any approval. The Stoics mastered this discipline. They lost people, they lost status, they lost comfort, but they never lost themselves. Because their identity wasn't built on outcome. It was built on principle, and principle survives disappointment. You're learning that now. You've already endured moments that could have broken you, but they didn't. You're still here, still standing, still refining. Not because you avoided the pain, but because you no longer resist its message. It told you clearly what to release, what to end, what to outgrow, and you listened, even when it hurt, even when no one supported your decision, even when it made you walk alone. That's the kind of strength no one sees, but everyone feels. It radiates not as arrogance, but as presence, a calm steadiness, a silent conviction. You no longer announce your healing, you live it. You no longer explain your boundaries, you enforce them with grace. You no longer ask if you're doing the right thing, because now you move with clean hands and a clear conscience. No guilt, no resentment, no performance, just alignment, and alignment is loud. Even when you're silent, it speaks through your posture, your pace, your decisions. People will notice. They may not say it, but they'll feel it. The difference between someone who clings and someone who releases. You've become the latter. You let things die that were already dead. You closed doors that had already locked themselves. You released weight that was never yours to carry forever, and now you're free. Not because everything is perfect, but because your peace is no longer conditional. It doesn't depend on who stays or what ends, or how well others understand your process. It's rooted in the quiet, where only your truth remains. You've let go, and now you see the path more clearly, without the weight, without the noise, without the false attachments that blurred your vision. This is what clarity feels like. Not comfort, not certainty, but direction. A quiet knowing that you are no longer trying to fix what was never yours to carry. You don't need closure. You need movement. You don't need to feel complete. You need to stay in motion. Letting go has made you lighter. And in that lightness, you've gained strength. Not the strength to control everything, but the strength to stop trying. You stop forcing conversations that only drain you. You stop trying to be understood by those committed to misunderstanding you. You stop revisiting doors that already showed you they were closed. And now you walk, not fast but free, not loud but deliberate. Not to prove anything, but to preserve everything you've built in silence. Letting go does not mean forgetting. It means remembering who you are. Without needing to carry everything that ever touched you, some moments will stay, but not all of them need to follow. Some lessons were meant for the climb, not the summit and you. You're reaching higher ground now. The air is different here, quieter, cleaner, lonelier, but not empty. There is space to think, to breathe, to rebuild. And that space is sacred. Most people try to fill it too quickly, afraid of what might surface if they sit too long with themselves. But you've learned to wait, to listen, to hold the silence like a blade. Because silence doesn't just reveal the truth, it removes what isn't. Every false attachment, every false need, every false identity falls away. And what remains is you, not the version that was shaped to be liked, not the one that bent to fit in, but the version that stood up alone and kept walking. The Stoics would call that virtue, living aligned with what is true, even when no one understands, even when no one thanks you. Especially then, because your discipline is not for display, it's for direction, and direction matters more than recognition. Let others wander, let others delay, let others cling to what was. You move. You do not look back with bitterness. You look back with clarity. You see it all for what it was. A teacher, a storm, a fire. And now that it's past, you don't go searching in the ashes. You keep rising with less weight and more precision. Because everything you released made space for what matters. And now, what matters is you, your standards, your energy, your decisions. No longer shaped by desperation, no longer distorted by old wounds. You've made peace with what ended. And in doing so, you've become someone who no longer needs to chase what's gone, to feel grounded in what is. That is rare, that is sacred, that is stoic. You let go and rose. Not because the past faded, but because you finally chose to stop carrying what was never meant to follow. Lesson 6 strikes deeper than most, because it breaks a silent hope, the hope that someone will understand your pain, that one day. They'll see what you carried, what you hid, what you survived. But the truth is they won't, and that's not betrayal, it's reality. No one will ever feel your battle the way you do. No one else heard the thoughts that tried to pull you under. No one else woke up to the weight you never spoke about. They saw the surface, they saw the mask, they saw the smile you wore to survive, but they didn't see you. Not fully. And that's what hurt. Not just the pain itself, but the silence that followed it. The absence of witnesses, the lack of recognition, the sense that your suffering was invisible, but that invisibility was your training. It taught you not to wait for someone to validate what you endured. It taught you that some victories are private, some healing is unseen, some growth has no audience. The Stoics lived by this. They didn't look for sympathy, they looked for strength. They didn't ask, "Who will understand me?" They asked, "How do I remain upright, even when no one does?" That's your question now, because the truth is you're not here to be understood. You're here to become unshakable. Understanding may come, it may not, but your path cannot depend on that. You've walked too far alone to need applause now. You've rebuilt too much in silence to ask for someone to explain your journey for you. You no longer need someone to say, "I see your pain," because you've already seen it and stayed standing. That is more than enough. The pain didn't break you, the silence didn't stop you, and the loneliness refined you. Now you carry something few ever earn, a strength built in private, no spotlight, no reward, just quiet effort, stacked daily against the weight of everything trying to pull you back. You didn't quit, not because you had help, but because you had resolve. You didn't ask, "Who will support me?" You decided, "I'll support myself," and that changed everything. You are no longer asking the world to acknowledge your growth, because your presence is the proof. Every boundary you hold, every distraction you walk away from, every moment. You choose alignment over approval. That is the evidence. Even if no one says it, even if no one claps, you know. You know what it took to stay when you wanted to leave, to speak when silence felt safer, to act when everything said wait. You did it, and not for them, for you. You stopped making your healing dependent on being understood, and you started making it sacred by being consistent. Now you don't explain your progress. You protect it. You don't broadcast your story. You live it quietly, precisely, with respect for what you've carried and reverence for what you've become. You stop waiting to be seen, because now you see yourself fully, clearly. Without distortion, you no longer look for someone to validate your steps, because you've walked enough in silence to know which ones were sacred. Every quiet decision, every unseen sacrifice, every battle you fought without telling anyone, they left marks, not scars, marks of self-respect. You don't carry resentment, you carry memory, not to reopen wounds, but to remind yourself how far you've come. This is how real strength is built, not by being rescued, but by refusing to abandon yourself. That's what you did, again and again. You stayed when it was dark. You moved when you were scared. You endured when it felt pointless. And all of it without witnesses. There was no hand to hold, no voice to guide you, no shoulder to lean on, just you. And the decision to keep going. That's what people will never understand. Not because they're cruel, but because they weren't there. They didn't feel the weight you carried. In moments that looked calm from the outside, they didn't see the war behind your steady eyes, but you did. You remember, and now you carry that remembrance, not like a burden, but like armor. You no longer crave recognition, because you've recognized yourself. You've named your pain. You've honored your growth. You've chosen your path. And now you don't flinch. When people question you, you don't bend. When they don't understand, because your roots are not in their opinion, they're in your experience. You grew through every silence, every disappointment, every goodbye that came with no explanation. You became resilient, not by choice, but by necessity. And now that resilience is your foundation, you don't seek sympathy. You embody sovereignty, you don't chase comfort, you move with clarity, you don't repeat your story, you show the result, because what matters now is not how much you hurt, but how much you've healed without needing attention for it. You don't announce your return, you just rise. You don't seek a crowd, you seek alignment. You don't fight to be understood. You walk with such truth that explanation becomes irrelevant. This is your new posture. This is your discipline. This is your freedom. Not freedom from struggle, but freedom from needing others to recognize it. You still feel, but you don't collapse. You still remember, but you don't relive. You still carry, but you're not crushed. Because now, you know what you're made of. Not theory, not words, but action. Action in silence, action in solitude, action when everything around you gave you permission to quit, but you didn't. And now you move through life with a different energy. The energy of a man who no longer needs to convince anyone because he already convinced himself. And that kind of man cannot be manipulated. He cannot be swayed by praise or broken by silence. He is centered, focused, present, because he is no longer walking for others to understand, he is walking to remain whole. You no longer ask, who understands? Me you ask, who do I become when no one does? That question has shaped everything. It turned your pain into structure, your silence into wisdom, your solitude into training. You stopped hoping for someone to carry your weight. You started building the strength to carry your own. And that decision changed the way you live. You wake up differently, not looking for support, but honoring your own discipline. You move differently, not to be noticed, but to stay aligned. You speak differently, not to be heard, but to remain honest. That internal shift is what no one saw coming, because they still think you're the same. The one who used to hesitate, the one who waited for reassurance, the one who needed permission to move. But that version of you died quietly, in a season no one noticed, in a moment no one asked about. You didn't make a scene. You made a decision. You buried the part of you that lived for recognition, that chased closure, that believed peace came from being seen. Now you know better. Peace comes from self-respect, from doing the work without needing a witness, from healing without needing a parade. You've become someone who no longer confuses loneliness with lack. You've learned that silence doesn't mean failure. It means focus. That absence doesn't mean abandonment. It means freedom. That solitude doesn't mean something's wrong. It means you're building something sacred. The Stoics lived by this. They didn't share every thought. They didn't seek validation. They didn't trade their energy for applause. They moved in quiet conviction, grounded in what mattered, untouched by what didn't. You found that space now. You no longer seek peace through others. You protect peace within yourself. And that kind of peace can't be stolen, because it was never dependent on anyone else. You found it in discipline, in the silence of early mornings, in the choices no one saw. You built it, brick by brick, by refusing to quit when quitting made sense. That's the kind of strength people feel when you walk into a room. They don't know your story, but they feel your weight, not the weight of burden, but the weight of presence. Because presence built in silence is unmistakable. You don't need to be loud, you don't need to be impressive, you just need to be consistent, and you are. Even when it hurts, even when it's slow, even when it's invisible. That's why you keep winning. Not because you're lucky, but because you no longer expect others to carry what was yours all along. Your pain, your healing, your transformation, you've accepted the solitude of responsibility and turned it into a weapon. Now you walk sharper, slower, stronger. Not in reaction, but in intention. You've become immune to the noise because you've trained in silence. And in that silence, you met someone the world could never give you. Yourself, unapologetic, undeniable, unshakable lesson. 7 is simple, but most will never live it. The less you need, the more powerful you become. This goes beyond money, beyond people, beyond comfort. It touches something deeper. Your center, your sense of self, your entire posture in the world. Because when you need less, you start moving differently. You stop chasing, you stop proving, you stop explaining, you just act. And that action is rooted in sovereignty. Most people live in quiet desperation, not because they are weak, but because they are dependent. Dependent on being liked, on being heard, on being seen. They measure their strength through reactions, through attention, through applause. And the result is instability. One harsh word, one forgotten message, one ignored gesture, and they crumble. Not because the pain is unbearable, but because they've built their identity on things they can't control. You've done the opposite. You stopped building outside and started building within, brick by brick. You constructed a version of yourself that does not collapse every time someone walks away. You used to explain, to justify, to seek approval. Now you remain quiet, not because you don't care, but because your peace is more important than being understood. The Stoics called this discipline. They weren't immune to emotion, they just refused to be ruled by it. They didn't pretend to feel nothing, they just trained themselves to act in alignment with their values, not their moods. That's what you're mastering now. You no longer wait for motivation, you act from principle. You no longer ask, will they accept this version of me? You ask, does this version honor the man I'm becoming? That shift, that quiet recalibration is the root of power. Because the man who needs nothing cannot be manipulated. You're not here to be needed, you're here to be whole, to stand without leaning, to speak without begging, to walk without waiting. That posture changes everything. You don't rise in public, you rise in your choices. The food you eat, the habits you keep, the thoughts you allow, the people you tolerate. Each of these is either sharpening or softening you. You've chosen sharpness, not in aggression but in presence. You no longer bend for comfort, you stand for clarity. You no longer explain your standards, you enforce them silently. And that silence is powerful because it doesn't ask, it decides, it doesn't debate, it moves, it doesn't need support. It is support. You've become that now, not fully, not perfectly, but deeply. You no longer seek to be everything to everyone. You seek to be aligned with yourself. Even if that means losing people, even if that means walking away, even if that means starting over, because peace has become non-negotiable. You no longer live for acceptance. You live in alignment. That shift cost you things, but what it gave you was worth it. It gave you nights of peace, without having to replay every word, wondering if you were too much or not enough. It gave you mornings of clarity, where your decisions weren't based on reactions but on values. It gave you distance from people who only loved versions of you that required your exhaustion. And in that distance, you found oxygen, because needing less is the path to breathing more space, more silence, more control, not of the world but of yourself. You've cut what distracts, what delays, what diminishes, and what remains is something rare. A man who knows who he is without being told. A man who doesn't explain his solitude because his presence already says enough. A man who walks away not out of pride but out of principle. This is not coldness, it's precision. You no longer argue to be right. You choose to be quiet, to remain focused. You no longer stretch yourself to keep others comfortable. You let them shrink away, while you continue expanding inward. This is discipline, the kind that cannot be faked, the kind that only silence can build. Because in silence, you met the one who doesn't flinch anymore. You met the man who no longer waits for permission, for validation, for proof. You became him, one unseen decision at a time. You gave up the need to be liked and replaced it with the need to be real. You no longer chase peace, you protect it, because you finally understood it's not out there, it's in. Every moment you say no to what used to control you, no to the impulse, no to the excuse, no to the expectation that you should always be available. Your energy is no longer free, it's earned, and that will confuse people, because they remember the old version of you. The one who explained everything, the one who gave too much, the one who apologized for simply existing. But that man is gone. He left quietly, while no one was watching. while everyone else was distracted. He died in the silence of your boundaries, and in his place stands someone new, someone slower to speak, faster to act, quieter in expression, sharper in direction. Now you measure your life, not by how much you do, but by how deeply you live, not by who stays, but by how well you stay true to yourself. And that cannot be bought, cannot be taught, only earned, through repetition, through resistance, through refinement. You live now with less noise, but more power, because the man who needs nothing is the man who sees everything. He sees through manipulation, through distraction, through pressure, and he does not move. Unless the movement serves his purpose, you've become that, through discipline, through subtraction, through silence. Not everyone will notice, but that was never the point. You didn't do this to be seen. You did it to survive. And now you don't just survive. You lead yourself with unshakable clarity. This is what it looks like. To rise without noise. You don't announce your transformation, you embody it. You don't ask for space, you create it by your presence. You don't prove your worth, you protect it by refusing to waste it. Every morning you choose simplicity over chaos, clarity over performance, integrity over comfort, and in doing so, you've made yourself untouchable. Not untouchable in arrogance, but in discipline. You're not immune to pain. You're anchored through it. You're not above doubt. You're just unwilling to be ruled by it. You've faced yourself and walked through what others run from, and that is what makes you unshakable. The Stoics would call this virtue a life lived in alignment with what cannot be stolen. Your peace, your character, your presence. And now, you carry yourself with a different gravity. People feel it. Even if they don't understand it, they sense the edge in your calm, the firmness in your silence, the truth in your boundaries, because you've earned your stillness. It wasn't given. It was built one hard choice at a time. You said no when yes was easier. You walked away when staying was familiar. You held your standard when it would have been simpler to lower it, and that's what sets you apart. You no longer seek shortcuts because you respect the path. You no longer envy what others have because you know what you've survived. You no longer wait to feel ready because you act from principle. This is the man who cannot be rushed, cannot be bought, cannot be shaken, because his power doesn't come from what he controls. It comes from what he's mastered within. You don't move for applause, you move for alignment. And that's why you're consistent, because you're no longer performing. You're simply walking in truth. Let them misunderstand, let them question, let them underestimate. None of it matters because you no longer live to be understood. You live to be whole. You don't repeat what broke you. You refine it into wisdom. You don't argue about your limits. You honor them and grow within them. That quiet self-respect is louder than any performance. It's not in how much you say, but in how little you tolerate. Not in how busy you are, but in how intentionally you move, not in how others treat you, but in how you treat yourself when no one is watching, because that's who you really are. Not the one on display, but the one who returns to silence and still shows up with strength. That's the lesson. You don't need more followers, more praise, more validation. You need more of this, more stillness, more clarity, more presence, and you've already started. Now finish the work, quietly, relentlessly, without turning back, not to prove anything, but because you've already become someone who doesn't need to. Same world, same noise, same temptations, same excuses, but not the same man, because you remembered who you were before the noise, before they told you to smile more, to soften your voice, to shrink to fit their comfort, before you thought love meant self-abandonment, before you believed being kind meant being silent, before you thought success was something loud. Now you know better. Now you know that peace doesn't require a crowd. That strength doesn't ask for applause. That presence doesn't shout. It walks. And every lesson you've lived in silence was a doorway, a passage back to yourself. Each time you let go, each time you stopped explaining, each time you cut what no longer served, you moved closer to something sacred, your center. Not the center others tried to build for you, but the one only silence could reveal. This journey wasn't about power. It was about precision, not about winning, but about remembering. And now you walk with a new rhythm, slower, stronger, unshakable. Not because life stopped being hard, but because you stopped running from it. You face things now with presence, with clarity, with alignment, and in a world that's constantly demanding attention, you've become someone who gives none to what doesn't matter. That is power, that is peace, that is stoicism lived, not studied. So don't rush back into the noise. Let this silence stretch. Let it remind you of what you've rebuilt, of who you no longer need to be, of what no longer deserves your attention. You didn't come this far to explain yourself again. You came to walk forward with the kind of discipline that doesn't need to be seen, to act with a sense of direction. No one else has to understand, to protect your inner space like it's sacred, because it is. Let others live loud, let others chase everything. You live quiet and become the kind of man the world can't shake, because the world didn't build you, the silence did. Now breathe, slowly, deliberately. And when you rise from this moment, don't look back. Don't negotiate your standards. Don't water down your decisions. Don't wait for permission. You've already earned your peace. You've already become the man who no longer needs to ask. You just live. And in that living, you leave a trail, not of noise, but of presence, of stillness, of clarity, of silent strength. And that changes everything. If this video whispered something you've needed to hear, don't keep it to yourself. Send it to the one who's still searching, to the one who's been quiet too long, to the one who forgot that silence is not weakness, it's preparation. Because some of us don't need more advice, we just need to remember. And if you're still breathing, still walking, still choosing discipline when no one's watching, then you are already one of the few